welcome to Life Science Live. I'm Robin, and I'm super excited for today because we are going to be talking about how animals survive cold environments. So any of you that live around the Provo, Utah area might have noticed this week that it got really, really cold. And on Sunday we even had some snow. So while we try and survive the cold, we can learn about how other animals survive the cold outside. So the first animal that we're going to be talking about is a polar bear. So polar bears live up in the Arctic region, up in the North Pole area, and it gets super, super cold up there. It can be, the average is about negative 30 degrees in the winter, which is so much colder than here. So because they live in such a cold place, they have lots of adaptations that help them to be able to survive that cold area. And one of their very notable adaptations that they have that is very recognizable to us, that we usually recognize a polar bear by, is their white fur. So their fur does look white to us, but it's actually a transparent or clear color. It just looks white to our eyes because of the reflection and scattering of the light. So there's lots of benefits to this. The fact that it's white helps them, or it appears white, helps them to camouflage and to blend into their snowy background. And the fact that it's actually transparent or clear helps the sunlight to penetrate through their fur easier and to get to their skin and warm up their bodies. And so the polar bears do look white, even though they have transparent fur, and actually underneath all that fur, they have black skin. And you can kind of see that on this polar bear here. If you look around the mouth area and at the nose right there, you'll notice that there's black. That's the exposed skin without any fur around it. And so the black skin helps to warm it up. The color black absorbs all the colors on the spectrum, and so it absorbs more light, and so it's able to be more warm because of that. If you've ever been outside during the summer on a really hot day and you've been walking around barefoot, you're walking around on the sidewalk, it might be a little warm, but you're probably still able to walk on it pretty well. But if you go over to the black asphalt and try walking on it, it'll probably burn your feet a lot more and be a lot hotter. And that's the same concept because the black asphalt will warm up much more because it absorbs more light. And so polar bears utilize the fact that black absorbs more light to help keep them warm in the cold. And so they have really thick white looking fur, black skin, and they also have something called blubber. And blubber is a really funny word, but blubber is another word for a really thick layer of fat underneath their skin. And that helps to keep them warm as well. And it also works as an energy storage. If they're caught in the winter or they're not able to find very many seals to eat or any other sources of food, they can rely on that blubber around them to draw on it, to use it to get energy for themselves. So they live in very cold environments and they have some adaptations to help them survive in the cold. And they also have some adaptations to help them survive in the snow, because there's other hard things about living in a cold place besides just the weather. If you've ever been outside after a snowfall, you might have noticed that you can't walk on top of the snow, right? Your feet sink into the snow. And so the polar bears live in a place that's covered in snow, so they have to be able to survive and to walk across the snow. So you'll see their paws right there. They have very big, flat paws, and they have a really big surface area. And so because of that, they work as kind of built-in snowshoes for the polar bear. Helps to distribute their weight across the snow so that they can paddle along and not sink into the snow every time they take a step. And it's also very icy up there, so the pads on the polar bear's paws have little tiny grooves and bumps on them so they can get traction as they walk across the ice. And so that's another way that polar bears are able to survive. And it's also kind of hard to see on this video probably, but polar bears have a sort of webbing in between their toes. And that helps them be able to swim around, because I mentioned earlier, polar bears like to eat seals, and seals are usually in and around the water, so polar bears have to be in the water a lot to be able to catch their food, and so they're able to swim really well because they have the webbing in between their toes. So polar bears have some really, really cool adaptations to help them to be able to survive. All right, so enough about the polar bears, let's talk about some other animals. And so we talked about how some animals have good adaptations to help them survive in the cold, but some animals, rather than adapting to the cold weather, came up with mechanisms to be able to get out of the cold weather. So next we're going to be talking about birds and their migration. So right here, this is a Canada goose. You've probably seen these flying around either in the fall or the springtime. So Canada geese will fly from the northern areas and go down to the southern areas where it's warmer. And that's not necessarily because they can't survive the cold. The geese actually do pretty well in the cold. The problem is there isn't very many resources to go around for the geese. The ponds and the wetlands that they like to live in like to forage for food are usually frozen over, and the plants usually don't survive very well, and so there isn't very much food or resources to go around for the geese. And so for that reason, they go down where it's warmer, where there is more resources to go around for them. And then they go back up north to the nesting grounds where they lived before when it gets warmer in the springtime. So the geese that you've seen flying around probably flew in a V formation. And that's because flying in a V formation helps to create less wind resistance as the geese are flying. So the guy in the front, the geese that's leading the flock, will get the most wind resistance. And so he gets tired out pretty quickly, so the geese will take turns being in the front so they don't have to stop. And it doesn't take as much energy to make the trip. So that's the goose. But there are lots of other kinds of birds that migrate. In fact, there's about 4,000 species of birds that make some kind of migration. That's a lot of birds, and some of them make a very far trip for their size. So this right here is a Calopi Hummingbird. You'll see he's much smaller than the Canada goose we just looked at. And so this kind of hummingbird will fly from the northwest parts of the United States down to Mexico. And we talked about how the Canada goose makes the trip, not because it can't survive the cold, but because it needs more resources, but because hummingbirds are so small, they're very susceptible to weather changes. They're not able to maintain their body temperature quite as well. And so these guys have to migrate to survive because they can't survive the cold, so they have to go somewhere that's warmer. And it's really incredible because they make kind of a comparable journey as the geese, but if you look at the comparison in the size, it's incredible that these tiny little hummingbirds are able to go about the same distance as the geese. It takes a lot of energy for them, and so a lot of birds will store up fat to be able to make their journey, so they don't have to stop as much. All right, so there's migration that some animals will do to get out of the cold, and other animals will do something called hibernation. You've probably heard this word before, especially in association with bears, and you probably think of it as taking a really long winter's nap, which is sort of true, but there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot more animals that hibernate than besides just bears. So this right here is an example of one animal that will hibernate. This is a white-tailed prairie dog, and there's many other animals that will hibernate. There's bumblebees will hibernate, bats will hibernate, hedgehogs, skunks, lots of animals that you don't see in the winter. Doesn't necessarily mean that they went away somewhere like the birds. It could just be that they're in hibernation. And so what happens during hibernation is it's much more than just a nap, like I said. What happens to an animal is their metabolic system goes down really, really low. Their body temperature goes down really, really low. Their breathing gets really, really slow. Their heart rate gets really, really low. And so because of that, it takes much less energy to maintain their body systems when they're sleeping. So their body just kind of goes into a sort of shutdown during that time. And a lot of animals will eat a lot of food and store up a lot of fat right before their hibernation so they can survive and they don't have to get up and go eat all the time. And they do need less energy. They require less food or energy from the food as they're sleeping because their body systems are so slow and they're so low. So that's another mechanism that animals will have when they hibernate. And there's lots and lots of variations to hibernations. Some animals will sleep for a really long time. Some it's just a little while part of winter. Some will wake up every so often and eat food. Some will shut down at some will be more shut down than others, various levels of being their metabolic systems will be at. And so there's lots of variations, but lots of different animals do it in order to survive the cold. And I think that sounds really nice to just be able to kind of shut down when it's too cold to go outside. You can just take a nice nap and get out of the way. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for learning about how animals survive in the cold. Hopefully everyone is able to stay warm this week and have a happy Halloween. And we'll see you next Thursday for Discovery Reading.